start over.
Okay.
Everybody tell me, hopefully you have a little thing that popped up that said record.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
All right. So hi, everybody. I'm Chloe Glenn, and I work for Franklinton Farms. I am the project liaison for the Buckeye ISA program, but Franklinton Farms is a large urban farm, produce farm in Franklinton. We are trying to engage more with community members, and so we're super excited to be a part of the Buckeye ISA program, which gets families who have young children 8 and under to learn how to grow their own food. And all of my participants are doing backyard growing. We also offer these classes. So thanks for joining us tonight, and thanks to Tim for teaching us all the stuff we need to know.
Thanks, Chloe. Welcome everybody to Integrated Pest Management, Pests in the Gardens. And I want to thank Franklinton Farms for the work that they do here in Central Ohio. They are leaders and they are committed to food security and food justice issues. And I make myself a better person by partnering with them. So we're going to be talking about pests in the garden, and those pests can take many, many forms. That can be weeds, that can be bugs, that can be disease, that can be nuisance wildlife. I am getting chewed to bits by deer. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start going through this presentation. I invite all questions to come into the chat box, and I'll pop up there and take a look at the chat box periodically to ask those questions, plus we'll have some time at the end. Please mute yourself so that we don't have any bleed over noise as we go through this presentation. So we are at the time of year where people are pulling their hair out because we are heavy into pest season. The bulk of the questions that I get on a daily basis right now are pictures of vegetables in distress with holes in them, and what is this bug and what is eating my stuff. And what we want to do is we want to go through the process to assist you as production growers so that you can make an accurate diagnosis to make sure that you're doing your best treatment method. And what we're going to do is we're going to talk about integrated pest management. And there's actually a definition of integrated pest management, and I like it. Integrated pest management, or IPM, is a sustainable approach to managing pests by combining biological, cultural, physical, and chemical tools in a way that minimizes economic, health, and environmental risks. And that's a mouthful, but it actually sums up what we're talking about here. Integrated means we have a system. We're using lots of different things that we want to do within our system to get a result. The pests are all the things that I talked about before. It can be a critter, it can be a weed, it can be a disease. And then this is really important to realize. We're talking about management because we want to get a harvest. We want to minimize our inputs. We don't want to cause a problem in the system. So we might not actually be talking about elimination of every last bug that is in that space, or taking the weeds down to bare ground. We want to manage them. We want to use the smallest dose to achieve the largest effect. So when we talk about IPM, we have 3 methods that we use. Cultural is the biggest one, and it's the one you always start with, although it's not the one that most commonly is started with. And then we talk about biological, and we talk about chemical. But what do we mean when we talk about cultural? For anybody who has attended any of the classes that we've done this year, cultural means the tools that you have in your toolbox, right? We're talking about things like mulching. We're talking about using a soil test to guide you. We're talking about crop rotation. We're talking about pick varieties that are actually resistant to disease. We're understanding all the things that you do with your hands that you can do to get that management strategy. One of the things that I have really gone all in on, and Chloe and I were talking about this earlier because we were talking about our cucurbits and our squashes and all the bugs that mess with them. I went all in on scouting and physical removal with my fingers of bugs this year, just to try it, because I'd never done that in the past, because it can get very overwhelming if you are just squishing bugs and squishing bugs. And I'll be honest, squishing squash bugs and stink bugs is not the funnest thing to do. And fun fact, their guts are blue, like a weird sort of bright blue if you squish them. But I highly recommend you do squish them, because that is a great organic cultural control method of those bugs. So we have so many things that we have as tools in our toolbox, and none of them would be a cure, but all of them used together in their small amounts are going to build on each other, and they're going to get a great total amount, right? Watering strategies. When we talk about how do we prevent fungal blight in tomatoes, we could go straight to fungicide, but that might not be for everybody. And quite honestly, if you get a fungal infection that you can visibly see, the amount of fungal elements there are probably in the millions. How do we use cultural IPM techniques? How do we use mulch? How do we adjust our watering strategies? How do we pick a tomato variety with resistance to these fungal diseases? How do we soil test to make sure that we have enough fertility for those tomatoes? How do we use the increase in organic matter? How does sanitation play a part? Did we crop rotate from last year and then get rid of that disease material? These are all the tools you use with your hands, generally labor intensive, but not necessarily monetarily intensive, and not generally things that get resistance, that can really, really make a positive impact on there. So here's a picture of my garden from a couple of falls ago, and I have some serious integrated pest management needs, because if you'll look at my garden, you'll see that I am on a pathway right here. There's a pathway around where the water spigot is. This is my neighbor's garden from a couple years ago, and yes, this is a burden of weed seeds in the tens of millions, okay? Here is the no fence between my garden and the woods. So the deer, they just walk in here. The rabbits walk in here. The groundhogs walk in here. The humans who help themselves my food walk in here. I have many different pests. Some of them have 4 legs. Some of them have 2. But this is part of the strategy you have to adapt. When the plow plows my garden, my neighbor's soil becomes my soil, so I can work on my organic matter and fertility all I want, and then my neighbors will get the benefit of it. So I really need to use all the tools in my toolbox if I want to get a harvest at my garden. Okay, huge tool. The best money you'll spend in your garden is a soil test, because when we look at a soil test, that is going to tell us what we need for fertility. And it's going to talk about things like pH, because we need to make sure that we match the pH as best as we can of where we're growing, so that the availability of the macro and micronutrients are there. When I worked in Hocking County, before I came to Franklin, we commonly got soil tests that were in the 5.2 to 5.3 range. That means that the macronutrient phosphorus, which is a huge need for plants, was unavailable. We had to lime. We had to bring that towards alkaline. If you don't have enough of your macro and micronutrients to match the growth needs of your targeted plantings, you are causing them to suffer. And here's the deal. Weeds don't care about the soil test. They don't read it. They're from here. They're used to nobody taking care of them. And so one of the most common things that I would note if I went into a weedy garden was, there's probably an imbalance in the needs of the fertility for the targeted plantings, so that the weeds can grow and the targeted plantings are suffering. Make sure you match the fertility to what you want to grow, and then your plants can compete on an equal footing. Mulch is probably, I'll just come out and say it, my absolute favorite tool in my toolbox. It does so many things. What it does is it cuts down or eliminates probably my 2 least favorite things to do in my garden. And Number one is weed, and number two is water, because my garden's pretty big. It's a 30 by 40 foot Victory Garden remnant from the 40s. From a long time ago, we have a lot of weeds and it's big, so I need to water a lot, especially when you get 95-degree temps day after day after day, which is what we have here. So I mulch crazy mulch. I use a mixture of organic mulch. This is hay. I use plasticulture mulch. I'll use straw. I try to put that mulch barrier down. What that does is suppresses weeds, cools the soil, slows down evaporative loss, keeps that soil cool in terms of where the roots are growing. They prefer that 70-degree temperature, and that benefits my plants in a tremendous amount of ways. Plus, I can roll this up, take care of it, use it again, and then I can till all of this organic matter under and benefit my soil at the end. Mulch is one of, if not one of the top 3 cultural integrated pest management strategies. Here's a couple of other ones just to demonstrate a couple of other techniques, right? So here's row cover on the left, and this is frost blanket that is covering spinach, but a lot of folks will use this early in the season, seal it down very, very well to protect plants from a lot of the bugs that really cause early devastation. Commonly used for things like cucumber beetles, Japanese beetles, squash bugs, stink bugs, where you let these plants mature under this protection. And row cover is great because it lets moisture through, it lets oxygen through, it lets sunlight through, but it keeps the bugs out. The plants can get a certain size on them before you uncover it, right? Because we're talking about pollinator dependent plants, plants that you need to uncover eventually. And then when you do uncover it, the hope would be that they've gotten big enough that they can actually fight off some of the problems coming their way. And on the right, this is a weed called Pennsylvania smartweed. And normally I try to keep my weeds down to the lowest sort of burden that I can keep them down, but I always leave a little bit of this growing because this is a preferential fridge crop for Japanese beetles. They eat this before they eat my veg. So I leave a little bit of this out, which allows me to scout for the beetle, and then it allows me to kill the beetles as they feed on this before they get to my plants. So an insect barrier, one cultural method of IPM, a trap crop, another cultural method of IPM. So here's a great cultural method, and I've done a lot of classes lately on fall planting because we are in the time window where we want to start planting the last bit of summer veg to get a fall harvest and the early batch of fall crops for fall harvest. So this is yellow crookneck squash that I planted a couple years ago in the first week of August. Right around now is when we can get that last planting in. This is using a cultural control method by using the life cycle of the bugs. You know, we worry about so many bugs with cucurbits. Cucumber beetles, Japanese beetles, squash bugs, squash vine borers, stink bugs. Tons of bugs eat cucurbits. Most of these beetles are starting to move towards their overwintered home and their life cycle is complete when we get into that September, October. So planting now and protecting the plant while it's young through a mixture of maybe some row cover or maybe some judicious use of insecticides allows this plant to go into production as a healthy plant when there's no bugs around. And so I took this picture in mid-October. I might have to throw some row cover over this plant, right? It's pollinator dependent, but it's a summer crop. We want to protect it from frost, but yet the insects need to get to it. But this is a harvest where this plant has minimal insect burden on it simply by planting so that we take advantage of what we know the life cycle of the insect is, right? That is using a cultural IPM technique. So let's talk about weeds because I had mentioned I garden in a Victory Garden. It's been around for 75 or 80 years, something like that. It's been putting weeds in the environment for that entire time. There's an old adage that says 1 year's seeding is 7 years weeding, and I wish that's what it was, but in a lot of cases it's not that. So 2 of the most common weeds that I have in my garden are lamb's quarters and red root pigweed, and the seed viability for both of those plants, and both of those plants are noted for an individual plant putting well over 100,000 seeds each plant each year when they go to seed. The seed viability for those is 29 years. And so I have a tremendous weed burden in my garden. But what I like to do is I like to do what farmers do. They mow, or they let their animals mow their weeds, right? Because quite honestly, there's a lot of viable organic matter in these weeds. They have sent their roots down. They're mining for NP and K. And when I return them to my garden, assuming there's no disease and getting them before they set seed heads, I'm improving the health of my garden. So when we talk about control of weeds and we talk about the cultural control, an annual that you kill as it is maturing and putting up its seed head, you've killed it forever. When we talk about perennials, when you mow them, chop them down, spray an herbicide, or do whatever, each time you do that, you weaken the energy reserves that's in that perennial. And if you keep that up over time, you can eliminate that weed. The take-home point is, don't let your weeds go to seed. Kill them before they get there. It can be mowing them, it can be weed whacking them, you can pull them if you want. I like to make sure that I conserve the organic matter and the nutrients in my plot if I can help it. It's not uncommon for me to just haul a weed whacker down there and go to town on them and let them decompose in place, as long as I don't have seed heads. So IPM Strategy for Biological has the 3 Ps: parasites, predators, and pathogens, right? We're talking about using some other living thing as a benefit in our garden. We have a number of impacts to consider, right? Because we are talking about agriculture when we're growing something for real, and that's different than nature. And then we have to make sure we talk about invasive species, because those are things that we want to make sure that we address in terms of keeping them out of our garden if we can. And then honestly, for biological control, a lot of what I do is simply increasing the biodiversity in my plantings, throwing a little bit of some pollinator habitat in there for other insects or shelter for other insects, because I want to encourage the beneficial insects to come into my garden, right? You have allies in your garden. When I look at an insect, the very first thing that I think of is this a good bug or a bad bug? Because if it's a good bug, I want to encourage it. If it's a bad bug, I want to kill it. But there's a difference between the two. And when you get comfortable with identifying them and knowing what the good bugs are and what the bad bugs are and how you can encourage the good and discourage the bad, you are going to encourage a whole level of integrated pest management that's going on without a lot of your input, because these critters are working in my garden when I'm working from home. Pop up in the chat for a little bit. All right, so question from Cindy is, can you cut out the part of the leaf that has the squash vine borer eggs on them? So Cindy, squash vine borers are a larval form of a moth, that the moth lays an egg at the base of a cucurbit, and that larval form then drills up through the stem. So while you can cut that critter out, and I've seen some recommendations where maybe if you heap a batch of soil over that stem, you might get some root growth in there. If you are talking about the squash bugs, yes, I honestly, when I remove squash bug eggs, I don't just scrape them off. I grab the entire part of the leaf that they're attached to and discard that. I rip it right off the plant. The plant's going to grow more leaves. I just want to make sure I get those eggs as far away from my garden as I can. So if you don't let the weed go to seed, can you use the removed plant in the compost, is a question from Casey. Yes, you can, for the most part. I wouldn't put a piece of like thistle or bindweed in my garden, because I don't want those to root, and those are ones that will root, like a mint. A mint will actually root from a fragment. A thistle will root for a fragment, so will a bindweed. But if I was cutting down some annual weeds before they went to seeds, yeah, I would have no problem putting them in my compost pile. In fact, I compost them on site at my garden. Question, does that fall planted yellow crookneck squash have downy mildew? There are whitish spots on the leaves in the lower left of the picture. Maybe a little bit of downy, or not downy, sorry. It might have a little bit of powdery. Downy mildew is much more severe in terms of the damage it can do to a plant. Downy mildew usually shows up as black and it moves a lot faster and it's much more devastating to plants. Powdery mildew shows up as a little bit of a white, and they are ones that a mild burden of a plant is tolerable. And then we have a question, are there certain weeds that can still go to seed after pulling? Yes, quite honestly, if you pull weeds and you get a big batch of root with some dirt on it, they might complete their maturation and go to seed right there. In fact, I've had a bunch of weeds that I've pulled where I'll yank them out and pile them up, and then I've gotten a rain that night and they just reroot on top of the soil and they just restart growing. So be careful if you pull them. A lot of times what I'll do is I'll pull them, I'll let them completely dry out so I know they're dead before I would incorporate them. What was the weed that trapped the Japanese beetle? That was called Pennsylvania smartweed, and I will type that into the chat box right now. Okay. All right, can you wrap the base of squash stems with foil or gauze to prevent egg hatch from penetrating? Judith writes, I have seen people do that. Yes, you do need to kind of bury that maybe like a quarter or a half inch in the ground, so you extend it a little bit below the ground, and you want to get it on there tight, and you want to extend it for a few inches up the stem so that that prevents an egg being laid. They may lay it on the outside of the foil, but it can't get to the plant. Bill asks, any tips on knowing if weed seed is mature enough to be viable in producing the next generation of weeds? Hope to eliminate prior to viability. Honestly, if I see the plant has a flower that looks like the flower is starting to die or dry off, I assume germination. If I can catch it early, where I have a bunch of flowers that are very early from opening, then I feel better about it. But if you have concerns that you might have had pollination, then I would not incorporate that. Carolyn writes, a great way to remove squash bugs is with sticky tape. Yeah, outstanding. And Pennsylvania from me, I'm fighting mare's tail. Need suggestions for control. Tisa, I will get you some offline recommendations. Mare's tail has migrated out of the agronomic crop world, and boy, it's got crazy resistance right now. If it's been any kind of mare's tail that has come out of a corn or a soybean field, which in central Ohio is very, very common, some of those things are resistant to things like glyphosate and 2,4-D and dicamba. They're just crazy things like that. So mechanical control is going to be best. You're trying to weaken that plant, but hit me up on an email offline and I will see if I can't get you a little bit better information on that, because I know I do have some links out of extension that talk about mare's tail because we have such a problem with it in things like corn, beans, or wheat. So I've covered my cabbage with row cover, but I'm still finding what I think to be cabbage looper and eggs. Why? Probably the larval form of the imported cabbage worm, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later on. That is a miserable bug, and it can cause some serious damage in there. My guess would be that the egg was laid before you covered it, because they will sneak through a tiny, tiny little thing, preferentially looking for their brassicas. Great questions, gang. All right, so we talk about biological things, and this is a very simplistic picture, but when I look at something like this, you see some feeding damage from at least two different kind of bugs, probably a bean beetle, probably cucumber beetles, but this plant is got a beneficial insect on it, plus it's in flower, plus it is producing a bunch of edge. And so part of what we talk about for integrated pest management strategies is the management, right? Just because we see some insect damage, if the plant is otherwise producing at a high level like this plant is, I would not do any treatment, because the small amount of damage to the plant is not outweighing, when we run a cost-benefit analysis, our harvest. So chemical. Unfortunately, this is where a lot of people start, and this is number 3. but it's still one of the things that we have on our list, and I use this a little bit. Chemical strategies, we're talking about pesticides, insecticides for insects, herbicides for weed, fungicides for fungal, and deterrents, right? Repellents and things that we would use for deer, fencing, I mean, would not necessarily fit in there, but you get the idea. We're trying to use chemicals to deter pests from eating our stuff. And for a lot of these pesticides, these herbicides, these fungicides, things like that, one of the things that is maybe not well known is the label that comes on those products. And I know that label can be difficult to read, and it might be a little teeny piece of paper that's been folded up into 5,000 cubes and stuck on there, or very tiny printing that I can't read even with my 1.5 readers. You are required by law to read, understand, and follow that label. And it's very important that you do that, because there are a lot of little details on that label that talk to things like post-harvest interval or withdrawal times before you can eat that, or impacts on pollinators, or the PPE that you are required by law to wear when you apply. So keep in mind that if you're going to do any of these things, organic or not, you're required to read, understand, and follow the label, and that is the law. So we talk about pesticides, and there's lots of inputs that you have to think about when you use them, right? Drift. I just got an email sent to me by a person who had sent me a picture of their tomatoes that showed quite clearly drift from glyphosate. So somebody had applied Roundup, and tomatoes are extraordinarily sensitive. A lot of these vegetables that we're growing are so much more sensitive to herbicides than the weeds. A lot of the bugs we're worried about are so much tougher in terms of resistance to the insecticides than the pollinators. So understand that when you use these products, you might be damaging the crops that you want to save or the bugs that you want to spare. And then realize that when we do applications, we have a period of time in a lot of cases where you are not supposed to harvest and ingest that food until you get past that time period, and that's organic or not. And then we talk about right time, right place, or right plant, right? If you try to spray a 5-foot tall thistle plant that is in active growth with a pesticide, you might make it unhappy, but you're probably not going to kill it, because that's not the right time to spray it. So anytime we were going to apply a pesticide, an herbicide, a fungicide, insecticide, whatever, you need to correctly time it to when it's actually going to be effective against the pest. And that requires identification of the pest and knowing where it is in the life cycle. PPE is personal protective equipment, right? Everybody should be familiar with that term in the world that we live in now. That is listed right on the label of these pesticides, and that is to protect you from exposure. And then, like we talk about resistance issues, applying it inappropriately or at a dose that's not correct actually selects for resistance for a lot of these pesticides. So we have organic, we have not organic. Keep in mind that all of them can potentially kill beneficial insects, and all of them have a label that you need to read. All of them are going to have PPE. All of them are going to have a withdrawal period on them after you apply, before you can eat that. I know for a fact that this right here, Captain Jack's Dead Bug, has a 1-month withdrawal if you apply it to asparagus for asparagus beetles, meaning that if you apply it when your spears are growing, you've eliminated harvest for the entire season, because a month later your asparagus is done. But we want to avoid this. So in my garden this year, I don't know if you guys noticed that we've had a really bad year for a few bugs. Flea beetles have been devastating this year, but we had this really weird phenomenon where right after we had like that 5 or 6 inch rain, we went straight into the 95-degree temperatures, and about 5 days later in my garden, we had a mass emergence of cucumber beetles. Thousands of them. It was a cloud. They were flying into me. I've never seen that phenomenon. I talked to one of our entomologists in FAES, and they thought it was the basically it was a mass emergence that was driven by the temperature, the rainfall, and the heat. And clouds of them descended on people's cucurbits and wiped them out. So a lot of folks kind of went nuclear on this. And this is a case where I took a picture of this garden, and this is a frustrated gardener, and I completely sympathize with them when you plant a bunch of stuff and you come down the day later and they're just chewed to bits. But when we look at pesticide application, and I'm hoping this is not something really devastating to pollinators, because this was a lot of a pesticide applied to every single plant. And that's a picture of the flower clusters on that plant. So if the pollinator lands on that and they want to do pollination, keep in mind the pests are harder to kill than the pollinators. The pollinators are going to die faster with a much lower dose of pesticide that, quite honestly, the bad bugs might be resistant to and completely shake off. So this is a question that I got a couple years ago from a client who called in, and they had asked about planting and they wanted to do some stuff, and they had referenced that they had just cleared the area. They had bad weeds in there, they had thistle, and so they sprayed brush killer down on that thing, and they were going to plant. And I said to them, have you checked the label on this brush killer? And they said they hadn't. And what I mentioned to that grower was, this herbicide has a 1-year withdrawal period before you can plant vegetables on that site. The grower did not know that. They wanted to plant immediately. That would have potentially put toxic chemicals into their food chain. So without beating you guys over the head with this too much, read, understand, and follow the label. Okay? So some of you may know I am a veterinarian, and we're going to talk about thinking like a clinician, because there's no possible way that you can actually memorize every bug, every weed, every insect, every disease, bacterial, fungal, viral, all of those things, because there's thousands and thousands and thousands of each of those things. So what I like to do is, if I'm trying to figure out diseases, and I still learn new things every day, I want to think like a clinician. I want to examine it. I want to think of if there's any tests I need to do. I want to do some diagnostics, right? You can use iNaturalist now on your phone that will tell you exactly what the bug is when you're standing in your garden. And then we come up with a treatment plan, because we want to make sure that we are doing a treatment that's accurate for the problem. Okay, so we examine them for signs or symptoms, and different bugs are going to do different things, and different insects, different weeds, different pests, different disease have different sort of habits that they do. Is it damage to the foliage? Is it damage to the fruit or the root? Is it damage to all parts of the plant? Or is it a single part of the plant? Is it all the plants in a species? Is it all the plants in the garden? Or is it just one plant, right? You look at this picture on the left, every one of my bean plants look like that. That's deer damage. And that is something that you can pick out pretty quickly, but you use your diagnostic process to come to that thought process. I like to use testing a lot. You don't necessarily need a microscope. I have one, but this is a picture that was sent to me by a client, and she sent me a very high resolution picture. It was like 5 megabytes. I literally was able to blow this up on my computer to the point where I could see the insects on these leaves. So take a close look. You have crazy tools at your disposal between extension, the internet, and your phone. You'd be surprised at what we can get done. And then we need to think about treatment, and we're using our IPM principles. Sometimes treatment's not even necessarily. We have scouting thresholds. How many bugs are present? How much damage has been done? We have to factor in the pollinators. If you have a pollinator dependent planting and you kill all the pollinators, you're not going to get a harvest. And then keep in mind, we have allies in the garden that are helping us. We want to make sure that we don't kill them by accident trying to kill the bad bugs. And then quite honestly, I'll be honest, I do use a little bit of pesticide in my garden, but I try to use the smallest amount possible. I don't do application when pollinators are present, and I never spray any pesticide on something I'm going to eat if I can help it. Okay, so diseases, bacterial, viral, and fungal. Each class of disease contains hundreds of examples. And so I don't necessarily try to memorize them unless it's some of the really common ones. Know your vegetable families, because a lot of these diseases are specific to the family. That's going to help you with diagnosis. understand if it's been there as the primary problem or maybe it's secondary, right? So when we look at that tomato up in the top corner, we see linear cracks. Those linear cracks occurred because I was unable to harvest this tomato before a big rainfall hit. So it was ripe and it was beautiful. We got a pounding rain and then it split open, not uncommon in tomatoes. The disease that is in there where it has some black growth inside the cracks, that's secondary. That grew because the tomato burst open, and that wasn't the cause of the cracking. And then was a vector involved? So a vector is something that transmits disease to your plant. And vectors are commonly insects, and they will take the disease from plant to plant. A lot of viral diseases are vectored from plant to plant by piercing, sucking mouthparts of insects. Cucumber beetles vector the bacterial wilt Erwinia that causes this wilt in cucurbits like we're seeing in this bottom right picture. So let's talk about insects. I see an insect, the first thing I think about is good bug versus bad bug. If I know it's a bad bug, I'm squishing it right away. If I don't know, I try to identify it first and realize that there are some bugs that they might be a little bit of both. They do some good things and they do some bad things. And so you have to figure out, is the bad outweighing the good or the good outweighing the bad? We want to find out if that bug's on our side. We want to find out what it's doing, because when we look at bugs in their life cycle, you might find that the adult form is actually benign and most of the damage is done by the juvenile, or it can be the other way around. And in fact, in beneficial bugs, there's a lot of beneficial bugs where their juvenile form, maybe it's their larval or nymphal form, is the form that does a lot of good. And by the time they reach adulthood, they're done feeding and they're not going to contribute in a negative way, but I would still consider them beneficial. Right? So if we take a look at this, this was a horrible year for flea beetles. It might be the worst year I remember for flea beetles. But when I look at my eggplant here and I'm thinking to myself, what am I going to do about this eggplant? I can see I have a few flea beetles on there. I'm going to squish them by hand, and they did a number on the older leaves, but the younger leaves are coming up and they're looking pretty good. We have enough photosynthetic mass of those leaves that we're going to get some energy build up from the sun in that plant. And I have my flowers out. So I can't really start applying pesticides now because I don't want to mess with my pollinators. So my IPM strategy for this eggplant was to do nothing other than periodically look at it and squish some of these flea beetles to decrease the burden, and do mechanical cultural IPM as opposed to using a chemical. Okay, so let's see. Jamie asks, when is the right time growth stage to spray thistle? Control for thistle ideally would be that you mow it several times throughout the year, taking off the seed head, using up the energy that would be inside its root mass. And then when we get to fall, you would spray it when it is building root reserves to overwinter, doing what perennials do, because when they're in active growth, they're using the energy from the roots and the flow of nutrition is going upwards. But when they're building root reserves in the fall, their flow of energy is going from the leaves down into the roots to build a big healthy root system to allow them to overwinter. So multiple mowings during the year, and you spray in the fall. Can purslane come back from pieces? I don't think it can come back from the top sort of succulent growth, but I found that when I'm yanking that out, at least lately with how dry my ground is, I'm not getting all of it out and I'm getting resprout from purslane. You made pesticides sound like a bad idea all around, yet you use them. When do you use them and on what pests? And so we'll say insecticides. I hope I didn't make pesticides sound like a bad idea all around. It is a tool in your toolkit. I want to make sure that folks are using those in a safe way, following label instructions to make sure that they are protecting both themselves, their plants, and pollinators. So I use pesticides, and I'll say insecticides, but because I use minimal herbicides in my garden. I use them according to the label instructions, meaning I wear the PPE that is recommended. I make sure that I use them in a way that protects pollinators, and I use them with the smallest dose that is going to get me the largest amount. So for example, Casey, when I plant a, say, zucchini transplant or a zucchini seed and I have a baby seedling, that is a very vulnerable time in the life of that zucchini plant. They are really susceptible to damage and they can be killed rapidly by bugs, cucumber beetles, squash bugs, squash vine borers. So I will apply a small amount of pesticide generally around the base of that plant and on the stem to protect them. Maybe it'll be 7-dust or permethrin, and protect them while they're young to allow them to grow. Once I start to see flower development and they get older, I stop with pesticide application because I don't want to negatively affect pollinators. So that is one use of pesticides that I have in terms of insecticides. Right now, my cucurbits are in full production. They are getting bombarded by cucumber beetles, squash vine borers, stink bugs, Japanese beetles, and squash bugs, but I don't apply any pesticides at all because those pesticides would negatively affect pollinators and potentially get on the food that I want to eat. Does that make sense? They are a tool in my toolbox. I like to use them judiciously, but following the label and using them so I make sure that I'm maximizing their benefits and minimizing resistance issues. Tips on squishing flea beetles. They are quick movers. I take my thumb and I try to pinch them down to the leaf and I smear them on the leaf. But you're right. I'm old and they're young and they're faster than me and they're tiny and I can barely see them. And that is in their name, right? Flea beetles. Those guys are quick. They can jump and they can be gone really, really quick. What about using soapy water to kill some of these bugs? So there are insecticidal soaps that you can use, but keep in mind that you need to use a soap that is actually safe to be applied to plant tissue. There are lots of different soaps that are out there, and depending on what form of soap that it is, it may be harmful to the plant because plants have pores in them called stomata that they will allow infiltration of applied surface materials. So if you are going to use a soapy water, I would use an insecticidal soap that is going to have efficacy against the bugs, but won't negatively affect the plants. All right, Casey says yes, great. I haven't used any pesticides for a little while, but I'm getting ready to use them because I will be planting a new batch of cucumbers, golden squash, and zucchini here shortly, trying to get a fall harvest. So I will break out my 7-dust and do tiny amounts around the base of the plant because I'm planting my fall planting in the middle of the worst part of the bug season. I might put row cover on them, but the worry that I have would be that the burden of bugs is so heavy in my garden that I'd hate to trap the bad bugs under the row cover. So I will use a tiny little bit, and then I will make sure that I follow my label, and then I will stop when the pollinators come in. So in terms of dish soap and water, there is so many different kind of dish soaps, and I know that there are some internet recipes and things like that out there, but just be careful what you use to make sure you're using something that's going to be beneficial. All right, here is one that I'm getting a lot of questions on, and we got questions already in this. So brassicas are attacked very commonly by the larval form of the cabbage white butterfly. The cabbage white butterfly is an invasive that was introduced like 100 years ago. It is elitely adapted to devastate our plantings. Mama lays one egg on the plant because she doesn't want competition for her babies. And it can grow over time, get really big, and eats lots of plants. And their camouflage is elite. They're the same color as the leaf. A lot of times you need to look to find that frass that is in the bottom of that. Ideally, you're scouting for this. You're looking for the bugs. You notice a little bit of damage and you're in there rooting around so you can grab this rascal and squish them. There are some organic controls for them out there, products that are labeled containing spinosad, just like it sounds, are fairly effective against this predator. Make sure you read the label and follow the withdrawal. But this is her egg. I actually watched one of these land on this cabbage leaf. I watched her ovipositor stick this egg on there. I pulled the leaf and I brought it home and put a magnifying lens on my phone. There is a real penny. That's how tiny that egg is. It's going to hatch over time, and that will eventually eat and eat and eat until it grows into this guy, turn into a butterfly, and hatch. This is tough to find them right there. A little easier to find them right there, but by this point, they've eaten a lot of your stuff. So scouting, I really have gone all in on scouting this year and trying to pull them off and squish them before they get too far in there. The ultimate in organic removal is my 2 fingers squishing them. No residue, minimal PPE, and I don't have to worry about that too much. So this is a common spinosad containing product, and this bug has been around for over 100 years, and they have a long period that they are active. They like cold weather, they like hot weather. So this is a picture that was taken from that mass emergence of the cucumber beetles that we had recently. This is a friend of mine who brought this plant down in the afternoon, and she didn't get to plant it, so she left it sitting in her garden plot, came back the next morning, and it had been skeletonized by bugs. We had an unbelievable mass emergence. Every cucurbit in our garden was crawling with them, and in one day, they wiped out every planting that was in there. That is how devastating cucumber beetles can be. We have the striped and the spotted. This used to be a little more rare, but now we see them all the time. They're not actually that closely related, given the fact that they have the same color, they do the same damage, and they ate the same stuff. Believe it or not, they're as closely related taxonomically as cats and dogs. One of the things that they do that's horrible, besides the fact they eat leaves, roots, stems, flowers, and fruit of multiple different crops, not just cucumbers, which their label, their name is cucumber beetles. They'll eat your beans, they'll eat all kind of things. They vector a bacterial wilt disease that will clog the vasculature of these cucurbits, and it can kill these plants within a day or two. So there's a beneficial insects, spiders, right? Wolf spiders actually have been found to be preferential predators of cucumber beetles. Now, I'm not sure if I want to grab a whole bunch of wolf spiders and sprinkle them in my cucumber patch, but I do leave spiders alone in my garden. They're generalists. They eat everything, but I've seen a bunch of research that shows they eat more bad bugs than good bugs. Same with these guys, praying mantis. They eat everything. Are they a good bug or a bad bug? Generally, they're considered a good bug. They eat everything, but again, when studies of their diet have been looked at, most of what they eat are bad bugs in there. And so that's why a lot of people will actually purchase casings with praying mantises in there and release them into their garden. So here's an example of a generalist bad bug. When we talk about how a lot of these critters affect plants within the same family, slugs will eat generally everything. And slugs are secondary to doing one of the things that I highly recommend you do, which is enrich your soil and add lots of organic matter because they like that. One of the controls that is recommended for this is to put a tin of beer out so the slugs will drown themselves in there. But there are great organic controls for slugs. There are products that contain iron phosphate, completely organic and break down into fertilizer that are very, very effective for slugs. So you do me a favor. If you want to put beer out for your slugs, send me an email. I'll trade you beer for iron phosphate, and then both of us will get the desired outcome. So let's look at some case studies. First thing, we're going to take a quick look at the chat. Is the iNaturalist mentioned earlier an app? Yes, Seek by iNaturalist. I have that on my phone. I love it. You can point it at a bug. You can point it at a leaf. It will tell you what it is. Very, very helpful. And it makes my life easier, and I want to make all your lives easier. So let's look at some case studies. These are all real world things that came to me, and this is where I'm trying to figure out how to treat something. So I just evaluate what's going on in there, and then I make a treatment plan. Okay, so here is a picture of a plot in my garden that is one of my very best and oldest friends that I have, and he is a fellow gardener. He has grown for 25 years in our garden, and he does everything the same as he's done every year. Same stakes, tomatoes go in the same spot, everything like that. And when we look at these, and hopefully he's not watching or else I'll get a text from him, but these plants have all died from fungal blight. There's no integrated pest management strategy that went into this, right? There's no mulch on the ground to keep the spores in the ground. There's no crop rotation going on. There's no sanitation in between use of this. These were not killed by the cold. While this is fall, these are pepper plants, and peppers are actually not as cold tolerant as tomatoes, and the peppers are still producing. So this is a case where there's fungal blight built up in this environment, and it's getting splashed up on the plants as it rains, and a number of cultural controls would assist here. So here's a couple of pictures that were sent in to me, and this is where taking a really close look at what's going on is going to help you with diagnosis of what's going on in here. So we have leaves from zucchini, okay? This is actually, this might be cucumbers and a cucurbita, or it might be winter squash. But if you look on the right side, you'll see that we have a color change pattern where we have some bright greens and we have some yellows. The bright greens are concentrated along the veins of the plant, and the yellow is in the interveinal portion of the plant. This is called interveinal chlorosis, where it is losing its chlorophyll pigment between the veins. When we look at the left side, we see that we have some yellowing around the green, but we have patchiness that is not associated with the veins. And so what we have is we have two different processes with two different treatments completely. On the left, this is a mosaic virus. This was transmitted to this plant by an insect who got it from an infected plant and then with a piercing sucking mouth part injected that into the plant. On the right, this interveinal chlorosis is from a nutrient deficiency, and this is addressed by addressing the fertility deficiency to make sure we have enough fertilization for this plant to grow healthy. So this is the bad bug that is in my garden that I am fighting right now on a daily basis. I scout every day in my cucurbit patch for 15 minutes. This is a squash bug. These are the eggs. I interrupted Mama, and actually she scurried away as I took this picture. When she lays her eggs, they're white. As they age very quickly, they turn to a bronze color. They're attached pretty well onto those leaves. Actually, what I would do is I would take my thumb and rip this whole piece of this leaf off and discard it outside of my garden. So in case they hatch, they have nothing that they can start feeding on. What you want to avoid is those hatching, because now these are mobile and they're moving all over the plants in my garden. They're feeding, they're voracious eaters, and once they reach adulthood, they're going to lay another egg clutch. So I do scouting and try to remove them before the hatch, right? Because I have flowers and I can't really do a lot of pesticide applications. So here is a picture that I took off a brassica, and normally you see something like that and you're thinking squish it. But I had not seen this. This was a couple years ago, and so when I did some research, what this is underneath this is actually a bad bug, and these are egg casings of a beneficial wasp. When they hatch, they eat the bad bug and then they fly away and kill other bad bugs. So this is a picture of a beneficial at work, an ally in your garden. Make sure that if you see something and you don't understand what it is, that you work to try to figure out an accurate diagnosis and contact me. I'm happy to help. We want to make sure that we identify it, because I would hate to have killed 30 allies in my garden. So here's another one that this picture was sent in to me, and the owner was asking me what's going on with his tomato plants. And when I looked at that, you know, you're wondering viral, bacterial, fungal, what insects going on with this. But actually the clue to what happened here is the nice green weed-free patch of lawn behind it. And when I did some extra questioning of the client, he had recently applied lawn weed and feed chemicals, and it must have been a windy day. He had some drift of 2,4-D or dicamba. So this is herbicide damage to his tomatoes. Tomatoes are extraordinarily sensitive to even the tiniest amount of herbicides, and that is basically knocked this tomato out for the entire year. He would need to replant because this one will not become a functional harvestable producer of tomatoes. So here's a question right here. Same bug on both sides. What is the IPM strategy? This is a tomato hornworm that I placed on this fence post. This bug is a bad bug. This is about 4 inches across. This can eat a tremendous amount of tomato. Great camouflage, difficult to spot. Here is the same tomato hornworm on top of a tomato plant, but it has been paralyzed with egg casings, right? You can notice the similarities to the slide we had just a minute ago. These are beneficial wasps. The mama has laid her eggs all over this hornworm. They have paralyzed it. It's done feeding. When they hatch, they will drill into this bug. They will eat it as food. They will mature and fly off and paralyze more hornworms. So this is one you squish and kill. This is one you leave alone once you make that diagnosis. And this is one of my favorite videos. Many of you guys have already seen it, but I think this is the slickest integrated pest management strategy of them all, although I'm not sure as a veterinarian I can recommend it. This was taken at a farm out in Madison County, and here is a hornworm, a giant one on cherry tomatoes. This was a market gardener. He had a half an acre with hundreds of cherry tomato plants, and he had actually trained his dog Reggie to eat them. That's a Labrador for you. That doggy just went around, and when he saw them, he ate them. No damage to the plant, no damage to the leaves, plenty of damage to the hornworm. I'll be honest, as a veterinarian, I have no idea if that's healthy. And so in good conscience, I can't recommend it. But boy, I thought that was pretty cool at the time. So we still have a few minutes for questions. I'm going to jump in the chat. And why are my tomato flowers wilting on the vine before they can set fruit? And who is eating the flower buds of my sedum? My garden is not accessible to deer. The first part of the question I can help you with. The second part, I don't know. Tomato flowers, pepper flowers, eggplant flowers, a lot of different vegetables get very stressed when we have temperatures like we've had them recently. When temperatures are over 90 degrees during the day and over 7 degrees at night, that heat stresses them enough that what they will do is actually drop their blossoms. And so we've gone through a period in the last month, and hopefully we're emerging from it now, where heat stress has caused a widespread batch of blossom drop in tomatoes, mine included. Peppers, same thing, where I have some healthy plants with almost no flowers on them, and we will have a sort of period of time with decreased production in there, and that's heat related. So Casey said, I have something that looked like white flies and they left behind a white residue. Are white flies common on outside plants? Yes, actually white flies are a fairly common bug, a bad bug that can affect multiple different plants. I saw a little bit on my zucchini plants actually earlier today when I was really inside the plant. So my zucchini is healthy and flowering, but no fruit. I have pollinators. I don't know what to tell you other than potentially heat stress right now. I'm still getting halfway decent pollination on my plants. I have eliminated any pesticide use for a long time. The hope would be, Casey, that now that we're going into a period of temperature with some additional rainfall that's projected in the 10-day. Looking at the 10-day, we have some nice little weather pattern coming up where we're going to be sort of mid to low 80s with mid to low 60s at night with a little bit of rain. I'm hoping that I get a jump start in a lot of my vegetable production. I've been just trying to keep the plants healthy to this point. How do I deal with a squash vine borer that has drilled in? There's multiple different things you can do. Honestly, a lot of recommendations are trying to salvage the plant, and they might not be successful. You can take a sharp knife and slit over where you think it is and pull that borer out, and then heap soil over the vine and hope that you get some root growth in that space. But unfortunately, if the borer is in there and it's really disrupted the vasculature, that plant might be a goner. Let's do with gardening, but general pest question. Why are there so many squirrels, skunks, and flies this year? I have noticed same amount of squirrels, maybe a little bit more skunks, and maybe not as many flies. But you know, we really had a mild winter, and so we didn't have any negative impacts of weather that kind of knocked back a bunch of pests. And the more winters that we see that are mild, we're going to see some changes in the burden of pests out there. And Jack writes, why are my tomatoes taking so long to ripen? Mine are doing the same thing, Jack. I'm guessing that it's probably heat stress related to that, because heat really causes plants to have to change how they do what they do. So Marilyn asks, how do I recommend solarizing the soil if you've had problems with tomato blights? You could try that. What I do is I try crop rotation. When I do tomatoes, I do a mixture of different varieties. I do some cherries, some heirlooms. I do some saladette style. I do some hybrids that have resistance. I try to crop rotate to a different part of my garden. I make sure that I maximize my fertility so that the tomatoes have everything they need. I add organic matter into my soil, and then I mulch heavily to make sure that I keep the fungal spores in the soil. And then I don't overhead irrigate. I gently irrigate at the base of the plant so I'm not splashing any fungal spores up on the leaves. How can you tell the difference between squash bug versus squash vine borer damage? Generally, I've found that squash bug damage is more at the top of the plant. They lay their eggs preferentially on young to fairly young leaves. If I see an old wilty leaf, I know I'm not going to find the eggs on it. When I do my scouting for squash bugs, I'm looking at the top leaves on the plant, but not baby leaves, ones that have a little bit of size on them. I look at the top and then I turn them over and look at the bottom. Squash vine borer damage, you're looking at the stem at the base of the plant within that 3-4 inches where it's in, you know, we're coming and emerging out of the soil. You're looking for an opening. You're looking for frass, which is almost like a very fine sawdust around the base of that stem where they tunneled in, and that frass is their fecal material. Do you have any recommendations on resources for natural treatments for weeds and bugs? Yes, so what I recommend is when you want to get knowledge that you can use in order to guide your treatments, when you do your search terms on the internet, add the word extension at the end, right? So if I was doing, you know, squash vine borer, I would put squash vine borer extension. And what that does is that gets rid of all of the non-research publications, and that brings up land-grant university and extension fact sheets and publications. Those are going to guide you. They're going to have a listing of treatments that are organic versus non-organic. They're going to have the cultural controls, great pictures, and everything that'll help you that way. So Tisa writes, where are the butterflies? Honestly, I'm seeing a decent batch of pollinators at my garden, but I'll be super honest, they were late by weeks this year. And when I was talking to some entomologists, we had, you know, that cold that really rolled late really changed a lot of life cycles. So to drill down on that, right, our last cold spell that we had in central Ohio, we had a hard freeze for days up until May 12th, like multiple days, 26, 28 degrees. May 12th. Last year, the last hard freeze date in central Ohio was April 2nd. That is almost 6 weeks of difference. And boy, that changed emergence of bugs, and I think that really delayed pollinators. So Tisa, I did notice a delayed emergence of pollinators, and I really had less of my cucurbits and green beans early on until they started coming in there. If wilt starts on eggplant, would you advise pulling the plant to prevent spread? So the common wilts that might affect eggplant are going to be more viral. They're not susceptible to the cucumber beetle vectored bacterial wilt. And that might be like a fungal blight, like a Phytophthora or something like that. Honestly, if the plant is that bad, and I say that from experience, that I would remove the plant. So one of my favorite tomato varieties that I planted is Oxheart, and I had an Oxheart in my tomato patch, and it showed me early in the season, for whatever reason, it had evidence of a viral mosaic virus. Early, I've never had that. But knowing that that can be spread by insects to the rest of my plants, I pulled that entire plant and it went in the garbage, not the compost. And so Casey says, I haven't seen a single monarch this year. That is, I've seen some. I've really only in the last 2 weeks seen heavy butterflies. Every pollinator has been delayed that I've seen, and it was only been about a month or 5 weeks till I really started seeing a lot of the native pollinators in the bee families, and I would say we're delayed on the other things. And then the cutie in my slide is a puppy dog that is owned by my colleague Christine Gelly, who is the Ag and Natural Resources Extension educator in Noble County, and he cut his paw, and we had to do treatment over the phone, and he had to wear his cone, and he was so sad, but he got better. All right, guys, we are bumping past 8 o'clock, so I want to make sure that we have gotten to all the questions. If you got maybe last one, how can I be contacted? No, that's a great question. Here is my email. Right here, feel free to email your questions. If you email me pictures, send big, huge files. That way I can blow them up and take a look at them. This has been recorded. I will put this on Growing Franklin, which is the website that I maintain for OSU Extension here in Franklin County within the next week or so. And here is the link to that so that you can reference that and take a look at it. Last question is from Rachel. Why would my green bean plants be stunted to maybe 6 to 8 inches? They're not bush beans. Everything else in my garden is growing like crazy. Well, that's a good question, Rachel. Offhand, I would say probably heat related, probably drought related. Those are the two biggest things that are going on right now. If you've not grown green beans in that space and you didn't fertilize them, they might be still developing their nitrogen nodules that they use to feed themselves, and nitrogen is the rate limiting nutrient that they need to grow. So those would be probably my number one, number two, and number three things that I would put in my list. So thank you for all of the very kind sentiments that you guys have put in. We're going to be doing lots and lots more classes in partnership with Franklin Farms and other things. I would like to give Chloe a chance to say thank you to all the attendees today. And other than that, it's been my pleasure. I hope everybody has a wonderful evening and gets lots of rain and lots of production.
Thanks everybody for coming tonight. Thank you, Tim, for giving us a really great presentation.
My pleasure. All right, guys, stay out of trouble, and this should be posted in the next few days on Growing Franklin.
Bye.